When Malcolm X left the NOI, he forged a new concept: Black Power stripped of its religious and cultish origins. Obviously, Marcus Garvey and Elijah Muhammad came before Malcolm, preaching black pride, power, and beauty. But it was very limited to the very fringes of society, because the men in charge were outlandish. Malcolm presented black power in a way that could appeal to a much broader group of people. And it did start with most notably Stokley Carmichael, somebody who had practiced under MLK, but grew tired of the trepidation. In his words, self-defense had to work with MLK, whereas for him, it had only been a single tactic to be used insofar as it worked. Just as the weakness of the right is their quickness to use violence to achieve their ends, the weakness of the left has always been trepidation. That's not to say random violence isn't also troublesome. It can sour public opinion. But even self-defense had been looked down upon in some circles of the left going back to abolitionist days. This has become a mantra of mine. Nonviolence doesn't exist when facing a violent opponent, only one-sided violence. But when we are being violent, even in self-defense, and all violence when fascists are involved is self-defense, it will still make the general public angry when we need them on our side. So the documentation of violence against us needs to be properly documented. Now, MLK did this with sit-ins, but you don't need to risk life and limb. Writing a play or movie works. Obviously, they didn't have camcorders in the 1800s, so the abolitionists gained sympathy by writing books like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Be strategic how you use your violence. When John Brown was in Kansas, he was needed, but the raid on Harper's Ferry was silly, and Douglas tried to tell him as much. From my own perspective, the main philosophy guiding me isn't desire for bloodshed, but rather the safety of people on my side. I want to avoid bloodshed at least as much as MLK, but while MLK thought the way to limit bloodshed was by letting his own people get slaughtered and beaten up, I intend to diminish bloodshed by advocating people getting murdered to defend themselves. So on the one hand, you need to document violence, and I will give King credit for doing so, though he could have done it in a better way. But you also need to defend yourself, or you, nor anybody else, will become a documentarian. The reason the Klan fell while the Nazis took power was because the Klan was so blatant in their use of force. While Hitler recognized early on, if you kill people quietly, that's far more effective. That's why Hitler murdered Ernst Röhm. Thankfully, in our modern context, it's easier than ever to document violence, and thereby gain much-needed sympathy. Most folks have a cell phone. Therefore, it's much harder for racists to cover up their acts of brutality. It was difficult enough in the 30s with Hitler, and is why he had to murder his most violent compatriots. While Stokley, he had a much different presentation than Malcolm. While Malcolm was good at stirring up his base, he probably wasn't so good thrilling people who weren't already convinced. Stokley, with his laid-back personality, could do both. His message was radical, but his delivery was smooth. He could therefore engage a much broader audience, and you need that boldness. You can't circumvent it. Constant appeasement, like MLK practice, only gets you so far. As we've seen with Neville Chamberlain, if you constantly try to negotiate, without any intention of using the stick, you won't go anywhere. Somebody like Hitler will come along and utilize your unwillingness to use force so they can arm themselves and prepare for battle. For Chamberlain and MLK, it was an inability to recognize the utter depravity that led them to their erroneous choices. But when talking about modern times, I think it's much more to do with the fact that both the right and the left received money from the Koch brothers, or some other billionaire. Biden probably does recognize that the Republican Party is fascist, but he wouldn't be president if billionaires didn't pay his campaign finances. So it's easy to look the other way when abortion rights are being stripped. It's better the national dialogue revolves around abortion, then why aren't billionaires being taxed more? Maybe he will do something in the future. I am still in favor of voting for Biden, even if he does nothing, because it's important to remember most presidents have done very little initially. Lincoln famously didn't want to free the slaves until 3 years into his presidency. I'll give Biden at least one term before I judge him. I've talked about the right's problem of hiding violence, and the right has another way of hiding it, which is through pageantry and art. The Deep South, prior to slavery, prided itself on its wealthy and luxuriant lifestyle to excuse the brutality and inhumanity of slavery, and Hitler showcased the organization and symmetry of German society to cover up the brutality that maintained social order and cohesion. America itself likes to present itself as a shining city on a hill, while people languish in the inner city. The whole process of maintaining power through bread and circuses has been around since antiquity. If you can't give the people what they want, give them a show. Hitler created, with Albert Speer, what I must admit was magnificent architecture. A dictator relies on art and architecture to justify their own power, not only to the people, but probably to themselves. Leftist movements usually begin in many different places with a wide variety of tactics. There isn't a whole lot of coordination early on because leftist movements are usually without money that makes close communication possible. However, given enough time, these various groups will eventually form a synthesis. For the right, there are various tribes of far-right people down at the bottom. But you also have a solid unit of people that make up the 1%, and they can quickly confer about what to do and how to solve the problems at hand. Therefore, the right can act much more quickly. Even close down at the bottom, they will be quickly funded by the rich up top. Because you have these two types of people on the far right, the wealthy and the greedy, and you therefore have two types of people on the left, those fighting against racism and those fighting against greed. Usually, those fighting against greed are farther along in their understanding of things. Not always, of course, but greed is the prime mover of racism and the cause of racism. But of course, those who attempt to reduce things to greed and not recognize that racism is a problem in and of itself are underestimating the problems of racism that racism can have when fighting capitalism. If all you're concerned about is fighting greed and ignore racism, you can find yourself easily duped, and that's why National Socialists came about, and why we are today seeing patriotic socialists and people who are supposedly on the left courting Tucker Carlson. Somebody who is racist will never align with black people to attack greed, even if they hate greed. Because when the wealthy see white and black people coming together, the solution is simple. They've practiced it in the United States since the time the New World was discovered. That is to benefit one group of whites, the whites, so that they can get most of the whites on their side to stop fighting against the pyramid structure of society. Whereas there is no obvious solution for people on the left who wish to incorporate racists and prevent infighting. For the racist who hates both the poverty of white people, but also the success of black people, the way to remedy these two spheres inside of them and to get to the middle of the Venn diagram is to enact that society where white people might not always be on top, but are always above black people. That is the middle ground for the racist, which suits the bourgeois just fine. So, for a leftist movement to succeed, those individuals courting racists must be expelled along with the racists themselves, or they will undermine the movement. They must also get political. If you allow people on the far right to control the government will destroy you through a Pinkerton raid or through COINTELPRO. Since the left doesn't have much money, sometimes voting for the lesser evil is the only solution. Since Biden, for example, is controlled opposition, he has to maintain that front. He has to throw the left a bone once in a while, or the facade comes tumbling down. Whereas Trump has no need to pretend to be other than what he is. He can go at the left with the gloves off. One problem for the dictator is appeasing the people once in power. Bread and circuses requires money, and the people's own money runs dry. Other sources are needed. That's why Hitler invaded other countries and why Russia is invading the Ukraine. Having enemies also expends the people's attention and energy that might be directed at the powers that be. Alongside Brown v. Board and the Civil Rights Act, the other great milestone of the Civil Rights era was the elimination of the draft. As a result, the energy of the people, if they so chose, could be directed fully now at the government. To this day, however, the bulk of the military are poor people, since fighting against oppression is no guarantee your life will be improved in the short term, while the military does offer immediate benefits. But of course, fighting other powers can be a benefit to those fighting for freedom down at the bottom, because of course the dictator must win the battles he fights. As his forces spread abroad, less money and energy can be spent oppressing people back at home. So the inevitable solution is to ease up restrictions at home in order to expand abroad, to let more people into the dictator's circle. The Confederacy and the fascists of World War II didn't do this, which is why they lost. America has constantly expanded its democracy, and as a result, an ability to maintain power. But when it comes into another conflict, as more people enter the club, the less chance there is that they will all be greedy sociopaths, and they will not like the oppression that takes place elsewhere. Therefore, the abolitionist movement came about. Not every white person is evil. So under these circumstances, war breaks out between those in society who want an unhypocritical democracy and those who enjoy the structure so long as they aren't on the bottom. Sometimes, like in Civil War, the Democrats win, and other times, like in Italy and Germany, and here in American South after the Civil War, the fascist wins, at least initially, until the dictator needs to expand in order to maintain power. This is the cycle of history and the class conflict that is constantly at play. The smarter dictator will avoid open violence to get what they want, and instead practice violence behind the scenes. This is what the fascist J. Edgar Hoover did, and why the Black Panther Party was crushed. Doing so will ease tension among members of the same club they belong to who aren't sociopaths. Another weapon of the dictator that should be mentioned is the cult of personality. If you can get people to view you as their savior and God, it's easier to control them. When people are afraid and insecure, they are far more willing to hand over power to somebody who promises to fix everything. American fascists have been doing this since at least 1920 with Birth of a Nation, claiming black people are rapists, and that they need to be kept in check. And again, Nixon and Reagan revolutionized racism by using crime in the inner city to create fear in the white suburbs. Hitler famously did this with the Jews and the Bolsheviks. Many fascists are doing this with the Great Replacement theory and LGBTQ. An important facet of a successful social movement is to have some place you can go when things get hot. Douglass was able to exile himself in Britain and Canada. The Black Panthers took safety in Algiers. And also, building ties elsewhere not only allows for a safe escape, but these other countries can apply pressure to the fascist state through trade and boycotts. The decline of the public image of the United States abroad is, I suspect, the reason people like Angela Davis and Huey Newton managed to escape jail. Also, finding support abroad is going to be easier than finding it in your own backyard, since the people abroad don't have the same sense of antagonism that white and black people do here in the United States. The reason some white people are racist here in the United States is due to competition of jobs and the purposeful agitation created by the powers that be who want to divide and thereby control society. A Swedish person isn't competing with a black person for jobs, nor are the powers that be in Sweden, if such powers exist, concerned with Swedish people fighting against oppression far away. It distracts from any problems happening in Sweden. Another major power of the Black Panthers is that they never allowed the opposition to frame them. When accused of being violent, Angela Davis reminded her interviewer in prison of the atrocities and violence committed against black people, and succeeded in establishing the shameful nature of the question. To accuse black people of violence is to ignore the violence black people have faced and the type of self-defense they needed to engage in to survive. When facing people who are murdering your children, how are you supposed to act to ensure your survival and theirs? Also, brevity. She didn't have long to speak, and many of the most famous speeches aren't very long, especially if you are representing a guerrilla movement. You aren't going to get the same access to express your ideas and defend yourself as the fascist. You need to be able to illuminate the problem and arouse them quickly. Sometimes it's because someone has a tremendous voice and thundering melody like MLK. But other times, like with Angela Davis, it's her knowledge of the system and the ability to recall facts. People listen to emotion, which both the fascist and the social advocate can utilize, but only the social advocate can utilize facts and reason. One powerful quote from a black bookstore owner in the documentary, The Black Power Mixtape, is the statement that black is beautiful, but black isn't power. Knowledge is power. Since we on the left lack money, one weapon we have, an advantage that we have over the other side, is knowledge and facts if we choose to educate ourselves, while the people on the right can only tell half-truths and build a mythology. We can tell the full truth, and we don't need fear getting trapped into a lie. We have much more freedom of movement as a result. We can remain on the attack far longer than the enemy. For myself, I also question some of the quickest and easiest ways to break the spell of the status quo is to ask a question. Why do racial disparities exist? Followed by what other alternative explanation is there other than that you think black people are inferior or because you agree racism is in power in our society?